of the Seminole Historical Society. You are in our museum, which is 4 years old right now. We moved in here with nothing and taken us 4 years to get to this point, and we are so proud of it. Really, really, really proud of it. Thank you. Let's see what else is going on. Then, back to Krabby Bill's. I'm so excited to say the Loader family, love them, and Sharon Spohn, they would like to do another October
Fish fry. Yay.
So we have it on our schedule. It is the third Saturday in October. It's the third Friday in October. There are 6 Fridays starting in September where we have music in the park here in Seminole City Park. Those are the nights that we're always open. That Friday night, the museum looks beautiful at night, as you can see, and we will be selling tickets. And that 7th Friday will be the third weekend, the third Friday in October, where we will have our fish fry again in our backyard. So we don't have tickets yet, we will, but put it on your calendar. The third Friday in October is our fish fry. So we're really, really excited about that.
That you joined us this evening. Thank you so much. We're going to learn about Old Fork.
So yes, I came all the way over from Daytona, and the good news is I heard that the president has declared I-4 a national emergency.
Yay.
When I got to the Seminole Casino, it took about 2.5 hours to get from there to here. I'm not kidding you. So I know the weather's pretty rough. So, but thanks for coming out tonight, and it's such a great crowd. I really do appreciate it. So I am from South New York. Anybody familiar with South New York? It's called Miami, or the 6th borough of New York. That's where I was born and raised, along with the rest of my siblings and my family. And all of our friends were, their parents were from New York. So I've lived in Florida my entire life, and I've lived in North Florida, Tallahassee, Central Florida, and then South Florida. And I've seen snow only a few times in my life, and it's an awesome novelty. Polar vortex up there, 86 degrees out here, pretty nice. You can't beat that. So I love Florida history, and it really speaks to me because I've lived here a long time. My dad came from South Chicago, a little place called Blue Island. He moved to Miami Beach sometime in the 1930s when he was a teenager. My mom moved down from Cleveland when she was young, and they met down there, and that's how I ended up being from the city of Miami. How many natives we have here tonight? Any? 0?
Not many.
Oh, wait. Okay, just a handful. All right, great, awesome. All right, great. So anyway, this is I do about 20 different Florida history topics. Last time I came, I did the roadside attractions before Disney, and of course Disney knocked them all out. They were all it's really kind of an interesting history look. So I work for let me just back this up, and I work for the Museum of Arts and Sciences Daytona Beach. Anybody been there before? Well, it is the largest general museum in the Southeast United States. It's about 140,000 square feet. We have exhibits on art, science, and history. We do all 3 disciplines. It's a Smithsonian affiliate, and I've been there only for a short while, 26 years. I was this big when I started, and I'm this big, and I'm this bigger now, too. Well, so I started when I was young, and when I started, the museum was only about 47,000 square feet. So I've seen all these amazing additions. And so, we have trains, we have the second largest collection of Coca-Cola artifacts. There's Napoleon's personal bed from his personal chambers in Versailles. That's his personal bed. You gotta be wondering, how did we get that? Well, yard sale, really. No, I'm kidding. I'll tell you this name and it'll make sense. William Randolph Hearst. Okay, we have a fossil gallery which has a mammoth in it, which I found in 2011. I found almost a complete mammoth on the side of the road, about 1.5 miles from the museum, behind the Saturn dealership. And so these guys working, selling, Saturn cars, they had no idea there was a huge fossil site behind their dealership. And so we have one gallery here called Visible Storage, which has 6,000 objects in one gallery. So you walk in there, and there's 6,000, eye candy is what we call it, 6,000 objects. It's really quite amazing. And that's called Visible Storage. We also have the largest collection of Cuban art in the free world. As I said, the second largest collection of Coca-Cola artifacts on public display in the world. This giant ground sloth is the best specimen of that species in the world. Napoleon's bed, and then we have the largest collection of historical Florida art in the world. We have art, Florida landscapes dating from 1743 to about 2007. And most of these artists aren't with us anymore. So many of the great artists came into Florida as tourists and fell in love with the state, painted landscapes as well. So, it's Chinese gallery, African gallery, it just kind of goes American gallery, it just kind of goes on and on and on. It's a huge museum and a digital planetarium. So I love it. I've been there a long time, and it's really great fun. So if you're ever in the area, you got to go to the museum because it's really worth going and seeing. And you have to have a couple. If you have 1 hour to spend in this museum, you'd have about 4 minutes per gallery. If you have 1 hour, that's how big it is. It's located by a really famous restaurant called Krispy Kreme. And when you're near the Krispy Kreme, you know you're near the museum. So, but it's a great museum. If you're ever in Daytona, it's not far from the Speedway, like near the cars from my office, practicing and going around. It's a really great museum, worth a trip to go and see. It really is. And I have to tell my friends from Miami and everybody else, yes, this world-class museum is in Daytona Beach. It's not in Miami. It's not in Charlotte. It's not, it's in Daytona. And it's hard for people to realize that because it gets overshadowed by the beach and Bike Week and the race weeks, where we have a really tremendous museum. And I just go on and on. We have one of the largest collections of Audubon prints, in the state as well. So,
What's the address?
The address is 3.
Besides Krispy.
You probably won't remember, but it's on Nova Road, 352 Nova Road. But if you just type in MOAS Daytona, then you go to the website and they'll give you the directions. So, but it is by the Krispy Kreme, though. I do rarely go there, though, I will tell you that. I don't go there very often. So I love Florida history. I got all these different topics I do on Florida history. I usually do about 2 a year, so I have about 20 now that I do. I'm working on a new one called Florida Fire. The Fire in the Sky. It's about all these urban fires that happened in Florida, like in Jacksonville, Ybor City, Ocala, St. Augustine. All these towns burned, back in the late 1800s. And I'm working on that presentation. I almost have it done. But this is one that I love, and it was inspired by this Florida landscape collection that we have, because there's a lot of images of forts in it as well. And I have a book with this, which is almost finished. I have a manuscript about that big, and it's almost done. It's really in kind of final edits right now, and I was hoping to have it out for this evening, but it's just not yet ready to be done. So it's called Legendary Forts on the Edge of Empire. Now, Florida's pretty amazing. I call it the land of forts. There's about 400 known forts in Florida, and we're going to do 400 forts in 400 minutes tonight. But what I did in this book and in this presentation is these are the forts that you can go and see. There's 200 Seminole War forts alone, and some of them, it might be just a stockade, but a fort is really a defensive weapon. It's a defensive position. It's really to defend a certain area. It's not an offensive weapon where you're going to go out and attack. But you can use troops to do that, but it's really to defend an area. And so Florida has a lot of amazing forts. And the ones that I've chosen in the book are ones that you can go and see. Like Fort Myers is a great story. The fort. It was a Seminole War fort. But it's probably in the middle of the river. And they don't even know where it is. So these are forts that you can actually go and see. I like to do history where you can go and see something and it's still there. And I usually like that type of history a lot. And that's what's in the book. So there's a lot of forts that aren't in there because there's nothing to see and there's just maybe a historical marker. And I can't cover every single fort. And many of these forts tonight we talked about could be a 1-hour lecture on their own. So I'm going to try to give you a nice gloss on some of these forts. And so what we'll do is we'll kind of start up here at the tip of the St. Mary's River. We'll come all the way down to Dry Tortugas, and then we'll end up in Pensacola. But we won't be able to get to every single fort because it would take a very long time to probably have a whole semester class on this. So anybody been to Fort Clinch? Fort Clinch is the best preserved Civil War fort in America, and it is on the Cumberland Sound. And basically, if you cross the St. Mary's River here on the Sound, you are in Cumberland Island, Georgia. This is the beginning of the Sea Islands of Georgia. And here's this pentagonal fort. So the forts are really interesting. It's called a third system fort. Now, what does that mean, third system? It sounds kind of kooky. Well, third system means basically the first system fort is like a wooden fort or earth forts. Those are the first type of systems of forts. And then your second system of forts, you get like a combination of wood and dirt. The third system of fort is a all masonry structure. So usually brick. And what ended up happening is in the War of 1812, almost all of the seaports were taken and the forts were destroyed, except for Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And then, of course, we have a lawyer out there, in his little skiff, and he's also a part-time poet, and he coins, this poem, by dawn's early light, which flag will still be above it. And so that sent a message that in order for us to protect ourselves from the English and from other invaders, we need to have masonry forts, because they couldn't be taken. And so by dawn's early light, I think this microphone just went dead. It's going in and out. But, yeah,
Do you want the other one?
Kind of going in and out, but that's okay. Hopefully it will.
Do you want the hook on one?
Yeah, let me try that one again. Okay, this is better. So the War of 1812, we have Fort McHenry. It survives, and so President Monroe, okay. So what we need to do is we need to have this system of forts that are now going to go all the way down the East Coast, and with particular attention to Florida, and then up into Texas. We're going to build these third system of forts, and they had slated about 300 of these forts, but they only made about 39 of these forts. And a good handful of them are in Florida. And this is one in Fort Clinch. And it is one of the earliest state parks as well. And it's located on Amelia Island on the St. Mary's River. It's named after Duncan L. Clinch, who was a Seminole War hero. And construction began in 1847. And then when the Civil War came, this was an important location. This fort was never finished. They had about 2 bastions completed at the outbreak of the Civil War. And under Captain James Finnegan of the Fernandina Volunteers, the militia, they seized the fort because it was abandoned. It was not occupied. It had no cannon, and this was going to be an important station for the Union because they needed southern refueling stations for coal. And they had this blockade system set up, this anaconda system. The Southern Blockade Squadron was going to blockade any type of illegal running or blockade running, and they figured that port would be a real hotbed for blockade runners. And so the Union wanted this. Now, when the Union was coming down, they were stationed in the George Sea Islands and at Hilton Head. The Confederates had taken over this fortification, which only had 2 bastions, no cannons. So what the Confederates did is they built these wooden platforms out in the sand dunes, and they put a lot of these big cannons on there. And the minute they would have fired, the platforms would have just collapsed on themselves. So they just weren't going to be able to support them. And Robert E. Lee came to this fort and took a look around and said, I hope the enemy is so kind as to wait for us because we're not ready. And on the other side of the river, they had some cannons as well, some emplacements over there. And the Union was expecting a big firefight. And this was the location for the largest American amphibious assault in American history. Was in Fernandina Beach, up until the Spanish-American War in 1890 when we invaded Cuba. This was it. They sent 28 gunboats and some 3,000 Marines, and there was 1,500 Confederates, and these bastions were not here. It's completed, but remember, this was only halfway completed at the time. And so they seized this abandoned fort. And under Samuel Dupont, who, under his flagship, the Wabash, they came down and they started to blockade the entrance, and they were ready for a fight. And then a slave had come out onto the beach and waved the white flag, and then they sent an officer on to talk to the slave, and the slave had said that they had left. Robert E. Lee ordered the evacuation of this fort, and they left, and without a fight. And so this was one of the first Union forts or Confederate forts taken in the war. And it remained in Union hands. And it was really, really important because all the slaves that lived in Northeast Florida, which is the first coast, which is where so much of the Florida population was, many of those slaves worked up and down the St. Johns River on these corn plantations. And if they could get to Fort Fernandina, to this fort, or wave down the gunboat that was going up and down the St. Johns River, they could get to freedom here. And many of those slaves came back and were stationed here and then operated in Negro regiments in Florida. So it's really interesting fortification. There's the original road. This is actually the original road. These are some of the original cannons. There's different, it's hard to tell, but this part of the bricks are made across the river in the town of St. Mary's. And it was made by slave labor. And then eventually this was completed by the Union soldiers. The New York engineers came in and finished off the fort. And they occupied this fort. And they invaded Jacksonville 4 times, by the way. They occupied Jacksonville 4 times. And so this was really an amazing fortification. You go up there and they don't force you into any type of tours. And you really get a sense of history there because it's a really weird juxtaposition. A lot of the original buildings in the center, they have reenactors on the weekends, original cannons. It's a third system fort, as I said earlier, and it could bring a real hellfire on anybody trying to come into that harbor. And when the Union took it over, Admiral DuPont sent 2 ships, the Pawnee and the Ottawa, to secure the area because the rebels had pulled out and they thought they were going to destroy everything and poison the well. So their operations, once they took over the area, the Cumberland Sound area, was to secure the property. And that's what they did. Anything in the area that they could secure to keep the rebels from destroying. Now, this was pretty interesting. Here's the fort, and across the way is the Kings Bay Naval Station, or the Kings Bay Submarine Naval Station. So you have this weird juxtaposition of what last of the ancient wars and first of the modern wars, the Civil War, and then you have, of course, like the Death Star here, you know what I mean, from Star Wars, this thing can destroy the world. And so you have this really wild thing, and it's really amazing because when I went there the last time, I was down in one of the casements, and all of a sudden this horn went off, and everybody was running up to the top gun deck, and I was there, and I ran up to see what all the hubbub. I thought maybe it was a freighter going by, and then all of a sudden you saw this black behemoth coming around the corner, and 3 Coast Guard cutters on each side with guys with big machine guns, escorting out the submarine out to sea. And there was a lady on the gun deck, and she was really crying next, kind of 10 or 15 feet from me, and I went over and asked her if she was okay. She goes, "Yeah, my husband, this is his last tour on the submarine, and he retires." And so she said she hadn't seen him out to sea in a long time. So it's a really great place. That's not the base, that's the stinky paper mill. So if we go down the coast a little bit to the next fort, and we leave what was once the largest amphibious assault in American history at Fort Clinch, we go down to Fort Caroline. Anybody been to Fort Caroline in Jacksonville? Yeah, so this fort is a replica fort. It was a triangular fort. They don't know where it's really located. The Rangers believe it's actually probably in the middle of the St. Johns River now. But it was located about 7 miles on a bluff upriver. And the French Huguenots came over under Jean Ribault and René de Laudonnière, who was the sort of the military leader. And they settled about 7 miles up the St. Johns River on a bluff. This is Spanish. This is part of Florida. So in 1494, the Pope, when new lands were discovered, he represented God, and he could give away newly discovered lands, even though they were already occupied by people. He gave most of the Western Hemisphere, or the New World, to Spain, and then a little bit to Portugal, like Brazil. This is called a papal line. And so La Florida went from basically the Florida Keys all the way up to Nova Scotia. So you might have been born in Florida, you just don't know it. And so this was a problem. And so the French Huguenots come over and they settle in the southeast coast, right on the St. Johns River, 7 miles up. And one of the problems is, when you've heard these stories a lot, in early American history, they bring the colonists over, the settlers over, and you know what they normally do? They bring the wrong type of colonists. They bring aristocrats, wealthier people, people who didn't know how to farm, they weren't carpenters, they brought a lot of soldiers. And back then, in the New World, the faraway lands make for faraway tales, and they get a fever. I mean, a lot of these settlers get a fever. Anybody know what type of fever you got in the New World? Gold fever. So instead of preparing themselves in the colony, many of them are out going through vast mountains of the hinterlands looking for gold. And they come across the Timucuan Indians, or that group that's in northeast Florida. And this is some of the first major contact between, an extensive contact between a European power and then, of course, the Native Americans in North America. And so this doesn't go very well because immediately they fall into famine and they're reduced to eating acorns and roots. And so they're having a lot of problems. And they build some huts and they build this crude fort. There are about 300 settlers come over and they have a couple of ships, 200 settlers. And it lasts about a year and it gets obliterated. But what ends up happening is that some of the soldiers commandeer some of the ships and they go out on the account. Now, when you go out on the account, that means you're going to become a pirate. And they go out, they try to turn to piracy because there was an ulterior goal here. And the goal here for some of these French soldiers was to gain wealth. And they could raid maybe some of these treasure fleets and some of this Spanish treasure coming up the Gulf Stream. And so this was kind of an ulterior motive. Also, they didn't have really good settlers either. That was a problem. So they get caught. The Spanish are alerted to their presence because they're trying to go on the account and attack Spanish ships. And King Philip II decides to send Pedro Menendez, who's a staunch Catholic, and he takes up his own money to come to Florida and to knock out what he calls heretics who are on Spanish land. And it takes on a sense of like a holy war, almost like a crusade, and he has 1,500 soldiers and 13 ships. Half of them are lost at sea by the time he gets over to Florida. So he makes, and the other thing about Pedro Menendez was the fact that his son had been lost at sea. And he believed his son was shipwrecked in La Florida and thought that he might find him in Florida. His son had not been heard of, and he did not know. So he was desperate to maybe locate his son, believing he was shipwrecked on Florida. And Menendez did find survivors from as early as Ponce de Leon, who had lived among some of the Southwest Indians as well. So this is in 1564, and then 1565, Pedro Menendez comes to knock out the heretics. And he goes to, he decides that he's going to attack immediately. And one thing about the Timucuans is that the Timucuan tribes, there's many tribes, they all don't like each other. They're all at war with each other. And immediately they try to start using these European powers off of each other. You know, immediately come fight, go kill my enemies. Matter of fact, we believe the word Timucuan means enemy. So when they first make contact, Timucuan, enemy, let's go fight my enemy. The French colonists, René de l'Ordinaire seizes the local chief, holds him for ransom for food. They're so desperate for food. Big battle erupts, called the Battle of the Questa. And it's one of the first European battles between Native Americans and a European power. So Menendez finds the fort because a Timucuan native knows where the fort is and says, oh, it's up the big river. And they called it the River May, which was the St. John's. That's what the French called it. And a small skirmish breaks out, but a storm comes, and he retreats back 35 miles to the Bay of Dolphins, which we call today St. Augustine. And there's a village there called Saloy, and a chief named Saloy there. And he sets up shop there, fortifies the chief's home, commandeers the home for his soldiers and his officers. And René de l'Ordinaire and Rabot now decide, in a short, I mean, this is a long story, but they decided to mount immediate attack. We're going to go and counterattack. And they take all their ships. They leave about 50 women and children in the fort and a few soldiers, just a handful. And they sail down to the Bay of Dolphins. And when you're sailing in the August period, bad things happen. They get hit by a tempest, right? And so they are washed. They're lost at sea. And Pedro Menendez says, this is a sign. Only the King of Kings would make this happen. And all these Frenchmen are lost at sea. Not all of them. The ships are pushed ashore around Cape Canaveral, Melbourne area. And he goes back to, he's in St. Augustine, and then Timucuan comes and says there's basically white men walking up the beach. And then so Pedro Menendez is going to find these groups of white men walking up the beach, and he's going to meet them at a place called Matanzas. And we're going to get to that story in a little bit. So this is great, because here is St. Augustine shown as a medieval village in 1565. And so sometimes you see St. Augustine depicted with mountains in the background as well, which is really interesting. So this looked nothing like St. Augustine. It has a medieval village inside the fort. So we're going to finish that story later. It's a national landmark. The first artist to come to North America was with the French, Jacques Lemoyne, and he escaped the slaughter that happened. Pedro Menendez, when these ships are lost at sea, he now mounts a counterattack. And during this hurricane, he marches with 500 men overland, led by Timucuans, to find the fort. 100 of them give up and head back to St. Augustine. He encounters the fort at about 5 a.m. in the morning, and he's about a mile away. And then it's daybreak. They overwhelm the 2 guards at the gate. They go into the fort, and they start massacring every man that they can find. And in that fort was the leader, René de Laudonnière, and Jacques Lemoyne, and a couple others. And they escape to one of the smaller French ships that are left on the St. John's River. They escape back to France. But a whole gaggle of them have been washed ashore on Cape Canaveral. And that one is Jean Ribault, who's the ultimate leader of the colony. And so he did all these crazy engravings of the first images of the New World for a really hungry European people who wanted to know what the New World looked like. So here you have this giant crocodile that's like 25 feet. They're ramming a giant pole down its mouth. Well, these are all fakes. They're not real. They're made up by DeVry, Tom Theodore DeVry, and he basically used Jacques Lemoyne's reputation to sell these engravings. If we move down the coast, you come to the next fort you can go and see, which is where there really is something to see, is the Fort San Marcos. How many of you all been there? I'm sure you've all been to Fort San Marcos. So this is the 10th fort. The 9th fort was located across the street, right somewhere where the Pirate Museum is, over there. That's where the 9th fort was. And they're all wooden. They burn, they're easily attacked by pirates, they rot out. And so this is the oldest masonry fort in North America. It's made of coquina, that soft stone and sedimentary rock. And cannonballs hit it and it just bounces off. It's called Star Fort, it's a medieval fort. And then here's a moat as well. When they were attacked by pirates or the English, everybody would run into the fort, the whole town. And then they put the animals in the fort, and then they would sometimes live in there for 2 months, the whole town of 1,500 people, plus the soldiers, just to escape. It was first built in 1672, and it's a bastion system fort. And then when we took it over in America, we called it Fort Marion, and we turned it into a prison. So many of these forts will have, American forts, will have one thing in common. When we don't know what to do with it, we turn them into federal prisons. So this was a federal prison at one point as well. The Castile was. Built a coquina. It took 23 years to construct. Started in 1695. The problem is it's always under siege. Spanish held on to Florida. They were determined to hold on to Florida, but it was an outpost. It was on the edge of the empire. It's the most significant and longest lasting Spanish colony that they had in North America on the eastern seaboard. They put a lot into it because it was important for those ships bringing up treasure on that. They could use this to attack pirates. The problem is, when they don't have a stone fort, it's easily attacked by pirates. Sir Francis Drake was the first pirate in the 1580s to attack, 1583. And he lands out on Anastasia Island. And they're terrified. There's a wooden watchtower out there at the time. They see it. 27 British ships. All the townspeople run out of St. Augustine. They run back into the woods. They're going to go into the wooden fort. And the soldiers left the wooden fort. They were terrified. They left all the pay for all the soldiers in the wooden fort. So Drake easily took the town because everybody just dispersed into the countryside. Well, as they were kind of on the outskirts of town, a Spanish sniper had snuck up, was going to try to dispatch Drake, and hit his second in command, Powell, which was one of his dear friends, and he was killed. And Drake supposedly had a horrible temper, and at that point he destroyed the entire city. Burnt everything and stole everything he could. Cut down all the orange trees, destroyed all the gardens, stole the windows, doorknobs, everything, and leveled the fort. And so that was one of the first attacks. Then the English now are in a place called Charlestown in 1702 in South Carolina. And James Moore is the governor. And he gets many of the citizens to participate. Let's go get Spain. Let's go get Florida. We'll make it ours. We'll turn it into a colony. And it's one of these wars that started in Europe and then came over here. And so he puts together this raid, this big party of Yamasee, 500 natives of the Yamasee tribe, and then other soldiers from the colony. And they put together, a lot of the citizens put up their own money for this expedition because they could raid and have riches, the spoils of war. And it's a two-pronged attack. They attack by land and then by sea. But this time now, there's no wooden fort there. There's a stone fort there. And it's siege warfare, like you see in Europe, where they're the trench war, where they're digging trenches, and they move closer, and they move the cannon in. They get within 100 yards of that fort, and they're firing cannonball after cannonball, and they just bounce off. And Governor Moore's like, we got to go to Jamaica and get bigger cannon. And he waits for bigger cannon. The problem is the hurricane season's coming, and a lot of his soldiers are sick. They're running out of supplies, and he gives up. But in the meantime, as you may know, the Spanish controlled Florida with all these Spanish missions. They didn't have a plantation economy. They had these missions and the cattle, and they supported St. Augustine. Well, on the eastern seaboard, and then, of course, in 1704, James Moore destroyed all those missions. And so, many times, St. Augustine faced famine. The way that they decided to build the fort is interesting, because another pirate named Robert Searles, who was an English pirate, caught, this is crazy, the flour ship that was coming from Cuba to bring the flour to St. Augustine was captured by Robert Searles, the English pirate. And instead of killing everybody on the ship and commandeering the ship and taking the flour, let's go to St. Augustine. And he holds the crew responsible to their normal duties. So when this flour ship appears, all the pirates are down in the below deck on this flour ship, and they shoot one shot. We're here. They send out the pilot, the harbor pilot. They capture him. They make him give the all signal clear, and at midnight they attack and basically, kill half of the town. But then they decided that was the time to build the stone fort. Another Englishman in another English war, the War of Jenkins' year in 1740, came down. General James Oglethorpe, the founder of Georgia. He brings down something really that had never been seen in a battle in North America. Kilted Highlanders. Now, I don't know if they fought in St. Augustine against the Spanish at a place called Fort Mazet, which was another fort that was 2 miles north of the city gates, which was pretty amazing. And same deal, siege warfare. His idea is he's going to starve out the fort, because everybody's in the fort now. Blockades the southern inlet and blockades the inlet. But a small Spanish frigate gets out and gets to Havana, and then reinforcements come from Havana, and then they decide to give up. And then he heads back to Georgia and waits for the counterattack at a place called Fort Frederica on St. Simon's Island. That's where it's his base of operations. So really pretty amazing. The English take over Florida in 1763. There's another European war. You probably heard of this one. The French and Indian War. This one started in North America and then went to Europe. It was a little different. Some historians call it the First World War. It's fought on different continents. And it's pretty amazing because now the English captured Havana. And that's the crown jewel of the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere in the West Indies. And they want it back. So they're going to trade junky old Florida. So a lot of times if you were a Spanish soldier, you got in trouble, you were sentenced to Florida. A town where it's not even self-sufficient. That's where you're being sent. Or an outpost. And so the English now, okay, well, we'll give you back Havana, and then we'll take Florida. And what they do, they don't really do much with the fort. But they take Florida and they divide it into two halves. East Florida, with the capital St. Augustine, and West Florida, with the capital in Pensacola. And West Florida went all the way almost over to New Orleans at that time. And then on the trivia question, you're going to hear this for the first time ever. When the signing of the Declaration of Independence, how many colonies were there? 15. East Florida was 14. West Florida was 15. They were Tories, though, and they got left out of the history books. So they were not loyal to the revolution. There were a lot of famous prisoners there. Chief Osceola was captured, and he had malaria, and he was imprisoned there when the United States takes over in 1821 as a result of the Adams-Onis Treaty. So now it becomes a federal prison. It's called Fort Marion. Then in the Civil War, this is really interesting. A lot of these forts, when there's no war, they're put on caretaker status. One person, two people. Sergeant Henry Douglas, at the outbreak of the Civil War, is in charge of the U.S. federal installation at Fort Marion. It's St. Augustine. St. Augustine is a Confederate sympathetic town. The militia, there's a Confederate militia called the St. Augustine Blues. 1,200 of them approached the fort against one Union soldier. Sergeant Henry Douglas. He's got a fight on his hands. And he goes, "No, you're not taking this fort." I got 1,200 dudes here, okay? 1,200 guys ready to fight. This war's just started. Well, I'll tell you what, you're not taking this fort. Are you kidding me? Well, if you write me a receipt, then I'll give you the fort. So they write him a receipt, and then he gave over the fort. And you can still see that receipt in the Army archives. So they wrote, the Confederates wrote a receipt. Here's your receipt. Give us the fort. Get out. And then so he left. That's a true story. Remember I told you they took Fort Clinch with the Wabash and then the flagship and DuPont? Well, he comes down and then he takes the fort. He takes over the fort. And then the St. Augustine Blues was the militia. And then they moved out and they went down to New Smyrna Beach and they hung out there waiting for their next order. So that was sort of during the Civil War. Then there was 200 deserters kept there during the Spanish-American War, federal prison. And then in 1942, they named it back to the Castillo. Calvin Coolidge, if you never thought he did anything good, or you don't know much about him, he did name it as a national landmark. Geronimo's wives and the Apaches were kept there as well, about 80 of them. Geronimo was not kept there and became a National Historic Landmark in 1966. When it first opened up as a national park, it was 10 cents to go in. There's some of Apaches. One of Geronimo's wives gave birth there. It's the first documented birth there, and it was a girl, and it was named Marion. She named it Marion after the fort there as well. So there's some of the Apaches that were held there. Here's a painting that we have by Frank Henry Shapley that's on display. He was at the Ponce de Leon Hotel, hand-picked artist by Henry Flagler. You know, he had these artist studios there at the Ponce de Leon Hotel, and he would do all these, all these great little landscapes, these topographical landscapes, very realistic of all the local landmarks. And so the fort was definitely one that was really, really popular. And this is one of the beautiful paintings that we have on display as well. Now, a lot of the Native Americans are gone, so these landscape artists substitute the African Americans in their paintings because most of them were used to putting in the Native Americans that lived in there, but they're all extinct in Florida. They're gone. I mean, the Seminoles that are left are about 200 of them. They live deep, deep in the Everglades. And then it was turned into a golf course before it became a national landmark. Henry Flagler thought that golf was a passing fad, but he put a 3-hole golf course on the grounds of the federal installation known as Fort Marion. It was an active military post. This is in the 1890s, late 1890s, and you played it 3 times to play 9 holes. And you could tee off here and hook your ball right into the fort, into the military base. And this is the first golf course in Florida, by the way. We go down to Fort Matanzas, and this is like a sister fort almost. This protected the back door to St. Augustine. Because pirates could come up that river and attack without any notice. They had a wooden fort there, and of course pirates burned it and destroyed it. But before they did that, one soldier had gotten off and had warned the city, and they were saved halfway down. So then they decided that they needed a stone fortification there. It had 5 cannons there. It's on Rattlesnake Island, awesome name. And there was a rotation of 6 militiamen there. And you had to be 13 years old, and you had to have 4 teeth. And you stayed for 6 weeks. So you could pull that, a powder keg, a little powder pouch you got there. And if there was any types of shenanigans with the English or pirates, they could get on a skiff or run up the St. Augustine War. But it could bring an incredible crossfire. It's a very dangerous inlet. It's very shallow to get a ship through there. So they could really bring an incredible crossfire. It never really saw any action, except that, remember I told you about Oglethorpe in 1740? He blockaded it. Nothing really happened. But in 1742, you might not know this, Oglethorpe is back. But he doesn't really engage. And they fire one warning shot. There's about 7 British ships off the inlet there. And they fire one warning shot, and then they retreat, and that was it. So really pretty amazing. This is the site where those men who were coming up from the French, remember I told you that they were spotted, these white men were spotted walking up the beach. Well, most people back then couldn't swim in it. That is a really treacherous harbor. I tried to take my 18-foot boat through that inlet, and I got shoaled immediately. It's very dangerous, and I turned around. And they couldn't get across. So what he did is that he would meet these groups of French soldiers from Fort Caroline as they were trying to walk back up to Fort Caroline. They didn't know it had been destroyed and renamed. San Mateo is now a Spanish fort. They didn't know all the 50 women and children were taken to Havana, never seen again. And they're marching up. They're hungry. They're thirsty. And Rabault, who's the leader, decides, well, he'll treat us well. This is how it's done. He'll treat us well. He'll treat us well. But what ends up happening is that Menendez is outnumbered. There's more Frenchmen than he has soldiers, and he has to feed these people and clothe them and house them. He takes them all behind the dunes, and they have to swear allegiance to Catholicism, and most of them have their heads cut off, and that's why it's called the Kansas Inlet, the Inlet of Slaughter. and all but about 12 were survived. And they came over in different groups, and they all were behind the sand dunes, and they were all basically killed and executed. And Rabot himself is executed, and as the story goes, Menendez put his head on a pike and marched triumphantly back to St. Augustine with Rabot's head on a pike. And most of the ones who were saved were usually musicians. My wife worked there as an archaeologist on this building here. The British took it over, but it was in bad shape. God will tell me what to do. They ferried across in groups. All but 16 were executed. Rabot was also executed, which is pretty amazing. It was a wooden fort. There's an artist's conception of it as well. And then it becomes a curiosity to a lot of these Victorians who come down here from the north to stay at the Ponce Leon Hotel. This is one of these excursions you could do if you stayed at the hotel. Once you got finished playing your 3 links of golf at the fort, you could go on an excursion on a little steamer maybe down to Fort Matanzas and see the old Spanish fort. When the United States gets it, it's old, it's of no military value. When the Spanish come back for a second period, because England only had fort for 20 years, or 1783. But when they come back, it had been hit by lightning, and you could only stay there in tents. When the British had it, your rotation, so the Spanish militia, 6 weeks rotation. If you were selected by the British to be down there, 10-year rotation. You had to be down there 10 years. Imagine if you had like a wife and a family, something pretty good. So it's been restored again. Calvin Coolidge was the man who did that. Here's a Seminole War fort. The way the Seminole War forts were done was really interesting. Every 20 miles, there was a fort. So if you were lost from your detachment, you would only be a day's walk to safety. So they built these forts. Some of them were just like depots or stockades, and some of them were more serious. The main headquarters, one of the main headquarters was Fort King in Ocala. And that's where the war, and of course with the Dane battlefield over here, were 2 of the places where Osceola ignited the war. Osceola's real name was Billy Powell. He was half Irish. And he was from, one of the Creek. He was from Alabama, northern Alabama. He's part of the Creek. He's not a Seminole. He wasn't born a Seminole. He was born a Creek. Seminoles had already been here. They've been filtered in for decades and decades and decades. And he was chased out every time by Andrew Jackson. And when he shed his Anglo name, he became Asialalo, or Yahola. He became Asi Yahola. Asi Yahola. I don't speak Creek. But Asi Yahola got corrupted into Osceola. So this is Fort Christmas in Christmas, Florida. Tiny little town east of Florida on State Road 50. And it was built by General Eustis. You heard of Eustis, Florida? It was built by him under the direction of General Jessup. And 50 wagons carried 20,000 rations. Now, I've been out, this is really, really remote. So, Sanford, Florida, on St. John's River, then you went to Fort Lane, then you went to Fort Christmas, and then on down to Judah. These string of forts. Because, it's logistics, it's very difficult. Some 5,000 Seminoles or Creeks lived. It's an amalgam of people. Choctaw, a little bit of Cherokee as well. And it was the one thing that the United States Army didn't realize was the black Seminoles. Fierce fighters. They fought much more fierce than the Seminoles did because they had a lot to fight for. They didn't want to go back into slavery. So the United States is fighting them. They're being armed by the Seminoles. That's taboo by the United States at that time period. And so this was a huge problem. They were considered property. And so this has actually been kind of being thought of more as a slave rebellion in Florida by these runaway slaves. And they fought. And Osceola had the loyalty of many of these black Seminoles to fight with him. And they fought fiercely. This was something that they didn't realize was going to happen to the United States Army. And they never were very successful. They won very few battles. You ever hear the Battle of Lake Okeechobee? That by Zachary Taylor? He lost that battle. He lost that battle badly. But but he wrote a glowing report about it, and then they made him a general, and then a president. So what ends up happening is they built 7 causeways, 20 bridges, 80 square feet. The real fort's about 2 miles away. It's a supply base. 3 months later, they abandoned it. And we know a lot about this because one of the surgeons kept a journal about it. So it's a replica fort. And they left about 80 soldiers. They went down to Jupiter after that because they had moved out of the area because the Seminoles fight in guerrilla warfare. We still fought these European tactics. Anybody been to Fort Jefferson? Yeah. The second least visited national park in America. The first is in Alaska in some glacier. You probably have to scale an ice wall to get to it. Well, they only allow 300 people a day to get out there. And if you hear the nickname of the boat that takes you out to the Dry Tortugas, you might think twice about wanting to go out there because its nickname is called the Vomit Comet. There's a private one and then there's the national park one. And a few years back, I'd gone down to Miami with my son, and I was just kind of showing him the ropes of where I grew up. And we were gonna take our spring break down, or no, it was between right before school started, and in August, but we didn't have the money to go there because it's expensive, and for a family of 4. And this is right when the $20 scratch-off cards had just come out, and my wife bought the first $20 scratch-off card at this convenience store. And when I'm in Miami, I received this call. She goes, "Guess what? We're going to Dry Tortugas." I said, "Well, we don't have the money to go to Dry Tortugas." "We do now. I just won $1,500 on the scratch-off card." So we went. Now, dummy me, big guy. Everybody said, "Oh, you got to take Dramamine. You got to take Dramamine." So we're running a little late. They don't wait. They pull out on this big ship. It's 70 miles due west of the Florida Keys. Okay. Sometimes it's 11 islands. Sometimes it's 7 islands, depending on the level of the water. And so right now it's 7 islands. Dry means no freshwater tortuga, land of turtles, and of sea turtles. It's discovered by Ponce Leon. So I stop at the CVS and I grab some Dramamine and I'm gonna take 2. I haven't been on a boat in a long time going that far out, 70 miles out in the ocean. I'm gonna take 2, so I take 2. And I look at the package, it says, "Drowsy." I got on that boat and I had the drowsy Dramamine and I'm like this. Oh my God. And then we get to the fort. And, we're going to go, so we have a tour, and we're going to go to the gun deck. And just, all right, we're going to climb up 3 flights of stairs at the top of that gun deck. So follow me. I'm like, oh, do we really have to climb there? I can't stand up. My legs are like rubber. But I worked through it, and it was awesome. You're on this boat, and it's just vastness of ocean. And all of a sudden, this huge brick citadel, this massive brick fort just rises out of the water. It's on Garden Key. It's a 13-acre island, and it rises up. It's a massive gun platform to basically keep away European powers from taking over the Dry Tortugas. And it was to mount 450 of those giant Columbiad cannons. You've seen those Civil War cannons. They only mounted about 120 of them. It's the largest brick structure in the Western Hemisphere, 21 million bricks. A lot of these third system forts were started by slaves and then were finished by the Union Army. Now, this was stayed in the Union the entire time. And it has a little bit of a deep water port here as well. But during the Civil War, the United States government, during the Civil War, they didn't know what to do with it, so guess what they turned it into? Federal prison. So they kept misfits there, people who were trouble in the Union Army were coming there, so they no longer needed slaves to finish the fort. It was never completed. It never saw any action at all. And then there's the Vomit Comet right there, by the way. So now I think today they only allow 150 people out there a day. It's very ghostly. It's really quite amazing. That's the picture I took on approach. There's over 200 shipwrecks there. That's why once they put that lighthouse there, it kind of reduced very dangerous area for shipping. But it could protect shipping coming out of the Gulf as well, which was amazing. One interesting story is Dr. Holder. He was like the surgeon there. And, you know, you're on a 13-acre island in the middle of nowhere, day after day after day. You could go a little stir-crazy, couldn't you? So Dr. Holder had captured this 13-foot shark, a man-eating shark. Everybody, all the prisoners named it Provost Marshal. And they put it in that moat. There's a moat around it. And they didn't feed it for 2 weeks. And then one day after church, everybody gathered up on the rampart on the top deck, and they found the biggest, fattest cat they could find. And Fat Charlie, who's one of the prisoners, found the biggest, fattest cat he could find. And when everybody's up there cheering, and when that shark is coming, he launches that cat right off the rampart, right in front of that shark. And that shark got so terrified it swam as fast as it could the other way. And that cat got up, jumped up on the wall, shook itself, and used one of its 9 lives that day for sure. You could say for sure. There's the moat. To protect shipping, this built in the mid-1850s. Lighthouse was built a little earlier. There's a great picture of the moat as well. It's where the Fat Charlie was up there launching the cat. 40-foot, 18-foot walls, 40-foot high. It's in, always needs a lot of repair. It's called the Citadel of the Gulf. Peak 2,000 people. 17. A lot of families were there as well. It's supposed to have 420 cannons, 37 separate magazines. 30 years to construct, but never finished officially. And then they had a very famous prisoner there. Your name is Mudd. Dr. Mudd. Yeah, Dr. Mudd, who was implicated in the assassination of Lincoln, was held there. But with Dr. Holder, when they had a bad yellow fever outbreak at the Georgia Tortugas, he helped. When Dr. Holder himself came sick, he stepped in and President Johnson pardoned him. Now, when we were there, just 2 weeks earlier, he had a lot of kids. He has like 150 descendants today. And they all meet once a year out there and are still trying to clear his name. And he has a famous news anchor. You remember him? Roger Mudd? Yeah. And they all have T-shirts down that say free, free Mudd. It sounds a little funny, doesn't it? Free Mudd. Want some free Mudd with that? So one of the last uses of this is where the USS Maine stopped off before it went to Havana. The first news of it being blowing up was at Georgia Tortugas, then on to Key West. Franklin Roosevelt stopped there and decided he was going to declare it a national monument. There's a photographic portrait of Dr. Mudd. I have all of his letters. There's a book on all of his letters that he wrote there trying to free himself. Yellow fever breakout. Pardoned by Andrew Johnson. Another famous visitor there was Hemingway. So my dad, when we were growing up, always talked about the incredible shark fishing on the Dry Tortugas. It was legendary. And he was a huge sportsman. He loved to hunt and fish, especially fish. He loved going out deep sea fishing. That was his gig. He loved it. Matter of fact, he was a little crazy. He and his friends, he called his friends the mob. And they were like one of his painter friends and his agent and the guy who owned the local bar, local hardware store. This group he called the mob. They would go deep sea fishing. He was shipwrecked to Dry Tortugas for 12 days. He survived on alcohol and fish. He's a little crazy. Sometimes they go shark fishing and they take machine guns and shoot the sharks with machine guns. There's a watercolor in our museum. Now, I'm not sure if this is a machine gun or a blunderbuss. And that is not Hemingway. That's the artist, Emile Ruppe. And this is Hemingway right here. And then there's this bloodbath of shark fishing that they would do. There's another great impressionistic painting that hangs in the museum, 1950 roughly, of oil on canvas. It's one of my favorites. Fort Dade. Anybody been to Fort Dade? Yeah, so I was just recently there with some other family members. One of the problems I have is that a lot of times when I go in and do all these forts and all this stuff, it always seems to be August and it's, 1,000,000 degrees out. Because that's, now my kids are just all now in college, so I don't have to adhere to this school schedule anymore so much, so that's kind of exciting. How many of you not been there? It's worth going there. I mean, you pick it up at Fort DeSoto. You take, it's fairly reasonable. They take you over a couple hours. Don't go in August. It's really rough in August. I'll tell you that when the summer time. But you can see this really ghostly fort. The Earl of Egmont, John Percival, he was an Irish politician, the Irish House of Commons, and it's named after him. There was a Seminole encampment here where they were going to de-embark the Seminoles to head out from the western reservations. But in the Spanish and American War, there's a lot of craziness going on in Florida. Everybody thought they were going to be attacked. Miami thought they were going to be attacked. Jacksonville thought they were going to be attacked. Tampa, Spanish Empire, they're coming for us. Well, obviously they weren't much of an empire anymore. But the problem is, European powers have upgraded their ships. They can now launch projectiles 8-10 miles. So William C. Endicott decided that we needed to upgrade the 1880, around 1890, we needed to upgrade our coastal defenses. And they gave about $127 million to upgrade coastal defenses. And this is one of them. But this is now modern day fort. You could climb all over it. It's really spooky. It's amazing. The whole city was there, about 300 soldiers. It never saw any action because the Spanish-American War was over in like 3 months. And more soldiers died from bad food and bad water than were killed in combat there. Hence the Food and Drug Act of 1906. Progressive era. And, but these are different now. You don't have those Columbiad cannons. You have these things called the Buffington Crozier cannons. They're disappearing carriages. They raise up, they fire, and they come back down. And it takes a long time. And they raise up and they fire and they can shoot a projectile. Now imagine how hard that is to hit a ship moving 8 to 10 miles out to sea. Pretty tough. It's a defensive position. It had baseball fields. On Sundays they played high school baseball teams. And it's really an amazing place. Here's Main Street. It had like a movie house and it had a bowling alley. Here it is, not 1943, but in 1943 they had a lookout station that was reactivated, and they spotted 8 different U-boats off the coast, and one of them was sank, and they found 2 submariners. There's the disappearing cannons right there. They raise up and they shoot. They became obsolete pretty quick as well. In 1923, the Tarpon Springs hurricane of 1923 wiped out the base, and they deactivated it as well. But it's a ghost town, and you can go and see this ghost town. It's really, really haunting. It's really a neat place. There's Main Street. You can see all this has been planted, and on this were buildings on each side. And there's some minimal interpretation out there. I wish they would do a better interpretation, but it looks like a lot of homemade signs, type of thing like that. It looks like something out of a movie set out of Hollywood. This is the sister fort to St. Augustine Castillo. Fort San Marcos de Apalache, 19 miles due south of Tallahassee. Anybody ever been there? This is the edge of empire. International crisis here. Andrew Jackson. It's really an amazing place. This is where the 6th flag was raised over Florida. You know, you hear 5 flags of Florida. This is where the 6th flag was. Pretty amazing. And the first fort was wooden by the Spanish, because this is important. The Appalachian Indian tribe is up in that panhandle there. It's like the bread basket for St. Augustine. A lot of corn, vegetables. There's all these missions there, Mission San Luis. And this is the port that supported that. They could take supplies down south of Tallahassee and out the port. And so they had like a little port down there, and they had a wooden fort there. But then these naughty French pirates came, and the Spanish did something really funny though to trick these pirates. They took the wooden fort and they kind of painted it to look like stone, but it didn't fool the French pirates. The Catholic priest decided he wanted to negotiate with the pirates and opened the door to the fort, and everybody was basically slaughtered, including the priest. They rebuilt the fort. A few years later, hurricane comes, wipes out everybody in the fort again. Now they build a stone fort. Stone forts are good. Wooden forts bad. 1739 they start construction of it. Okay? And it really doesn't see much action until the First Seminole War. Actually, a little bit, let me back up on that. Around 1800, this guy is a ruffian. He's out of control. He's an adventurer, a pirate named William Augustus Bowles. He's from Maryland. And at 12 years old, he goes to Pensacola to defend Pensacola against the Spanish with the British. And he gets in a lot of trouble. He's a kid. They throw him out. He takes his uniform, throws it in Pensacola Bay, wanders back to Baltimore, but the Creek Indians pick him up and take him into his tribe. He's like a kid. And he learns the Creek language, marries the chief's daughter, and now he's got a lot of influence amongst the Seminoles up there in the Creeks. And he decides that he's going to create a utopian society in Florida. And it's going to be a sovereign nation just for the Southern Indians. And he's got this whole utopian society thing set up, ready to go. He's just got to find a way to get the Spanish out and keep the Americans out as well. And so he decides that he has a lot of support among a lot of the young warriors, and they're going to fight, and they're going to go to this fort and take over this fort. And they lay siege to the fort. Now, the Native Americans rarely did siege warfare, only a few occasions, and they did it here in Florida at this fort under the leadership of William Augustus Bowles. And the Spanish, this is the second Spanish period, greatly weakened power. They have very little military presence. There's a lot of border clashes. The English are still in the area, stirring up the Native Americans. It's a mess. They have no control. Slaves are running away. It's a problem. And there's a lot of these issues. And this guy decides he's going to be the king of Florida and create a utopian society, name himself king of the Southern Indians or of the Seminoles. But he's a white guy. And the Creek chief's like, no way, we're going to make him in charge of us. He might be like a war leader and a great soldier, but he's not in charge of us. So they even have their own flag. This is quite amazing. He even has his own flag. It's called the State of Muscogee, and he's going to be the king of this utopian society, the southern refuge for all the Southern Indians. His alias was also known as Billy Bowlegs. Matter of fact, he is so wanted by the Spanish Empire that they are willing to give an amazing ransom for his capture. They will give you, or you, or you, or you, or you, who turn him in 1,500 kegs of rum for his capture. Would you like 1,500 kegs of rum? You bet you would. So in 1800, he takes over that fort. It's an absolute disgrace. Siege warfare by natives. They're considered savages. This is terrible. They don't know how this shouldn't happen. Well, remember I told you have East and West Florida? The governor's in West Florida. He's outraged. And he sends basically like an armada to take back the fort. And William Augustus Bowles, this huge armada comes, a huge amount of Spanish soldiers come out, and they retake the fort. What ends up happening is that William, by the way, he's also a comedian and a portrait painter. He was a comedic actor and actually had been in New York trying to be a comedic actor. So he's right. It's a big story, but more than we have time for. I'm just kind of glossing some of these details with you. What ends up happening is that he tries to retake that fort again and fails and loses credibility among the Creeks. And then he gets betrayed and he gets turned in and he gets captured. And then he's never seen again. He's taken to the dreaded El Moro Castle in Havana. Today, what ends up happening again, this is amazing. In the first Seminole War, around 1818, Andrew Jackson comes in, takes over that fort, kicks the Spanish out, takes over the fort, captures these two British mercenaries in the area. This is now right around the Tallahassee area. And he says, these two British guys are inciting all the Creeks. They're inciting them to fight, inciting them to cause all types of problems, and they're resisting, and I'm going to hold these two British guys accountable. And he holds his own military tribunal on the Florida frontier in the middle of nowhere on the Gulf Coast, 9 miles inland. And he has this tribunal set up for Robert Ambrister and Alexander Arbuthnot. And he holds this trial in the middle of the frontier. And his court decides that these guys should be let go. They're not guilty. He goes, oh yeah, they're guilty. And they need to be executed. And they were executed. See, Andrew Jackson hated the English. Killed most of his family in the Revolutionary War. He despised them. Most Americans did back then. They were not well received. And it causes almost a war with England. Many of the English citizens are calling for a war with the United States over this. And then they ended up backing off. But he was shunned in Congress and in the Senate for this outrageous behavior. He's a tough guy. Then a hurricane hit this fort, and it was turned into rubble, and then the Confederates take it over and call it Fort Ward. And when the Union lands at St. Mark's on the coast, huge armada again, huge fleet, lots of Marines, these soldiers out of Fort Ward meet at a place called Natural Bridge, and they defeat the Union Army. It's one of the last battles of the Civil War, and especially fought in Florida. It was a major campaign in Florida as well. There weren't many big ones. And Tallahassee was never taken. This is my last one. It's a wild story at Fort Pickett's. Anybody been to Fort Pickett's? Pensacola, on Santa Rosa Island. They claim to have the world's most beautiful beach. It's got to be the most beautiful beach. Incredible. And when you're on the road that goes on the barrier island, it dead ends into that fort. Just dead ends into it. But again, it's these third system fort, about 16 million bricks. It was real hush-hush because this was done with, bricks made in Pensacola, and it was done with slave labor, and it was outlawed. You couldn't do that, but they did it anyway. Captain William Chase oversaw the construction of this fort. He was a Confederate sympathizer. And it was completed in 1834, had about 100 cannons. It was designed by a French engineer, Simon Bernard, and then built by Captain Chase. And this is the only fort, and the largest fort in Pensacola, because it is the land of forts, Spanish forts, English forts. This is the only fort built out on the island. Huge, massive fort. And what I didn't realize in American history is how many places that say the Civil War started in their town. Because you're always told, it's like, Charleston, right? I didn't know so many other places claimed the Civil War started in their town, not there. Pensacola claims that the first shots of the Civil War happened in Pensacola, and they might be right. So it was not occupied at the beginning of the Civil War. It was dilapidated, terrible condition. But there's all these other forts. Here's Pickens. It's named after him. He was the Revolutionary War hero. Here's a wood engraving of it. And the person in charge of another fort, they have all these forts on the mainland. One was called Barrancas, one's called McRae, and a famous naval yard. Pensacola is important. You can build ships at the naval yard. You can repair ships. It's a deep water port. It protects the Mississippi. It gets you into the interior of the country, of the southeast there. It's important. Really important. Well, Florida is a Confederate state, and Slemmer is here, and he's not at Fort Pickens. He has at this other fort called Barrancas, over on the mainland. He has about 80 soldiers with him in this fort. And one night, before the shelling in Charleston, Confederate militia come in and they want the fort, or they're outside the gate. And Slemmer says, no, can't have it. And then the small skirmish starts, and these are the first shots shot at each other in anger at each other. Now, Cape Hatteras says the war started there. I don't know the story of that one. I know the one here at Pickens. It's pretty amazing. So he decides that this Barrancas, this is not a safe place. I gotta go out to the big fort. So he takes those 80 Union soldiers, abandons Barrancas, and goes out to Pickens. Meanwhile, just a A few weeks later, 8,000 rebels pour into Pensacola, and they take over Barrancas, and they take over Fort McCree, and they take over the Naval Yard. This is a wood engraving by Harper's Weekly, the most important newspaper in America at the Civil War. This is the first media war, the first war brought into your home. They had this new technique where they could take these wood engravers, and they would take the wood engraving block and cut it up into 2-inch blocks and have a whole bunch of engravers, and everybody would be assigned that 2-inch block, and they could put it the same level as the typeset now, and they could put in all these illustrations. Harper's had to send out reporters and artists to go and document this stuff. This is the only one known at Harper's during the Civil War that was done by a woman. And her name was Mrs. Lieutenant Gilden. And this would have been sent back on a train or a ship back to New York. And she did this artwork. And then it was reinterpreted on a block of wood and on an engraving and then put into the newspaper. It became a Union newspaper, a pro-Union newspaper, and became a pro-abolitionist newspaper. But it did something very unusual in today's world. It gave usually just the facts. It tried to give both sides. And it tried to be very honest in their reporting. That was really unusual. There's a map of the fort. So there it is. There's Pensacola. And then there's the Naval Yard. And this was supposed to bring a crossfire to any English or Spanish or French, whoever is going to come in and try to take over our beloved country. It wasn't designed to shoot back. They had to remount all the cannon to shoot back at our own people. Which is pretty amazing. There's that. This is on display in the museum. In the Brown and Brown Museum, where we have all the Florida landscapes. And Mrs. Slemmer did this artist interpretation. Now the original artwork gets destroyed when you put it on the wood engraving. It's reinterpreted. And here, America is in the Union is in the sunlight. The clouds of war and Fort McCree are in, it's turmoil. And then this artwork's really, it's this big. It's in a newspaper. When you blow it up, the detail, it's a black and white process. You can see even the gun on the soldier. It's really amazing. The detail's amazing on these engravings. It's all done on newsprint. Now they're pieces of incredible, not only the art, but incredible pieces of American history. This is the first trouble. In New York was this regiment, volunteer regiment, of rough, tough Irishmen who had a reputation for being drunks, pickpockets, thieves, chimney sweeps. And they put together this regiment. They're called Wilson Zouaves. And they were nicknamed after a French mercenary group out of Algeria. And these were rough and tough guys. And they were sent down to protect Fort Pickens. Now, Slemmer's no longer in Fort Pickens. He's been replaced by Colonel Harvey Brown. Colonel Harvey Brown says, I don't want these guys, these cutthroats, these undisciplined soldiers, these volunteers, they're not regulars. They have to camp a mile east of the fort. He didn't want them mixing it up. Matter of fact, those guys, the Zouaves, they wanted to fight the regulars. They wanted to fight anybody they could. These were fighting Irish. That's a bad joke. But these guys are going to be in the first big battle of the Civil War in Florida, known as the Battle of Santa Rosa Island. So the Union decides, let's sneak over to the Naval Yard. There's a Confederate sloop over named Judah. And they sneak over there, and the night ops. Night ops is really rare in warfare back then, going all the way back. It was pretty unusual. And they burn the Judah. And a couple Confederates die. A little firefight breaks out. Union comes back to Fort Pickens. Well, General Braxton Bragg now has 8,000 Confederates facing off with about 2,000 Union over on Santa Rosa Island in Fort Pickens. Union has some warships there as well. And there's just this truce going on. They're just waiting. And then President Lincoln, when he finally takes office, he reinforces the fort. And then these guys come down. And what ends up happening is that the Confederates counterattack. they sent 1,500 soldiers over. And they land on the east side of the fort, a couple miles. And as they're marching west to the tip of Santa Rosa Island, to Fort Pickens, to take it over, they run into these guys, these Irishmen. You know, these Billy Wilson Zouaves. And the Wilson Zouaves, they had this reputation. They were kind of pranksters. They said, Fort Pickens said, well, if there's trouble, fire your gun twice or 3 times, and we'll know you're in trouble. Well, they were doing this all the time as a goof. Like you cry wolf. So when all of a sudden now the real deal has happened, here's a Harper's Weekly engraving of their encampment. When this happens, the Confederates come across this huge firefight, they shoot off the guns, everybody's like, they're goofing with us. Well, finally they realize, okay, something really is going down, and then the soldiers pour out of Pickens, and they go to the rescue of these guys, but they get hit pretty hard, and they lose this battle in Union. Like 112 of them are killed, another 120 are wounded, and most of them are buried in a mass grave somewhere there as well. And then like 80 Confederates, and then they retreat back. Well, Colonel Harvey Brown says, this is the biggest disgrace to the United States. This is a disgrace. And he vows revenge. And here's big action. You didn't know there was big action in Florida. Here it comes. Fort Pickens, November 22nd and 23rd, 1861. Fort Pickens, in the daybreak, opens up fire on Fort McCree and Fort Barrancas. They launch 5,000 rounds over 2 days. The Confederates returned fire with 1,000 rounds. Fort McCree is absolutely destroyed. And they have some new cannons there that are on some of these ships that have a rifled cannon. It has these grooves inside the cannon. And instead of a round ball, it's got this pointed projectile. And it just obliterates these brick forts now. And now these third system forts are obsolete because of this new technology. Last of the ancient wars, first of the modern wars. Now, Barrancas is safe because they had piled up mega sand all around the fort. And so they were really kind of spared. And it bombarded, and they bombarded the naval yard. The next day after the bombardment stopped. This is really an ecological disaster now. You don't hear about this much in the Civil War. It was said that millions and millions of fish floated up in Pensacola Harbor that had died from repercussions. Millions and millions. It was reported in Harper's. General Lee is now suffering defeats, and he orders the evacuation of Barrancas and the naval yard, and they give it up. Now, it probably may have extended the war a little bit. It wasn't like if we didn't take Pensacola, we weren't going to win the war. But we eventually take over Pensacola. Some of the African-American regiments come in, and then they take over duty in Pensacola and are stationed there. Massachusetts, the 51st, remember the one in Glory as well? So here's one of my last stories. After the Civil War is over, caretaker status falls into dilapidation. But now, the United States government has a code word for the most famous, as they call it, Indian. They called him the Big Indian. His name was Geronimo. He's captured. Pensacola newspaper called him, his medicine ship, because he was a medicine man. They called him his medicine ship. So these Pensacola boosters get this idea, well, he's going to St. Augustine, right? Remember I told you all the Apaches were there, the Geronimos and his wives were there. That's where they were headed. But he gets diverted to Pickens in Pensacola because some of the local politicians had petitioned Grover Cleveland and said he's really better off at Pickens. So about, 16 or 17 of the warriors, including Geronimo, are now stationed at Pensacola. And on the newspaper in Pensacola, it says, world-class tourist attraction is here. And they sell tickets to go out there and see him. And some days they had 400 people going out there to Fort Pickens. And you had to buy a ticket from Loomis Langdon at Barrancas, and then you could go out there and see him. It was 1887. It's a tourist attraction. On the train over, he was so famous that at the train station in Mobile, Alabama, over 1,000 people were at the train station trying to get a look at him. He didn't speak English, he spoke Spanish, and then Apache is what he spoke. And so he was very, very famous. And then he was put to work pulling weeds, raking, stacking old cannonballs at the fort. And then you, if you live in Pensacola, or a tourist, you could come in and buy a ticket. There he is. Pretty sad, you know what I mean? Just went out there and walked at him like he's a circus freak or something. I mean, it was really bad. But what ended up happening is even the Vanderbilts came down. Their yacht pulled out, tugboats, anything you could get that was on a ship, and hauled people out to go and look at it. And Geronimo said this is another broken promise. You said, the United States government said, you wouldn't break us up, you wouldn't separate the families, and you did. And one of his wives had a baby in St. Augustine. So eventually they decided to bring over some of the family members, and they decided this wasn't the proper place, and then they moved him out to another fort in Alabama as well. And of course he went on to be, really an incredible folk hero. Anybody know which one he is? That one? There he is. That's him. Yeah, that's him. One of the rules when he was there was no alcohol. We're not allowed to take alcohol. And when he was on the train and stopped at these depots, he would sell all types of stuff. So he would go up to some of the other people on trains and give me this and sell it to people and say, this was mine. So he was a little bit of a salesman as well. He was an interesting guy, really interesting. And then there's this big hole in the fort here, and a fire broke out, probably near the bread ovens in 1899. And it got to 8,000 pounds of powder in one of the casements. And of course, these things always happen at late at night, like 3 or 4 in the morning. 8,000 pounds explodes, obliterates a huge portion of the fort. And bricks are flown into the city of Pensacola. One soldier's hit by a brick and killed. They're literally flying through windows at 4 in the morning and landing on people's roofs in the city as well. It's a national park today, and it's a great story, the whole history of all those forts out there. You can go out and see all these forts out there. It's really amazing. So, Florida is the land of forts. I'm trying to get the government to make this license plate that says Florida, the land of forts. No, I'm kidding, I'm not. But anyway, it would take a lifetime to learn about all these forts as well. I hope you really enjoyed the program today, and hopefully you realize that this is an interesting way to learn about Florida history. You can learn about Florida history through landscape paintings. You can learn about Florida history through so many different vehicles of our history. And forts is just one way that I like to do it.